What does it feel like to be a slave?
Father was a slave.
He owned my grandfather and my father. My grandfather was a blacksmith, and my father had learned how to write a little bit in Richmond, Virginia before he brought him down there.
To be owned and sold like a property, beaten, battered, and treated like an inferior species.
Of slavery as ancient history. We think of it as something that happened a very long time ago to people we couldn't possibly have known.
For years, historians have focused heavily on the role of men during the slave trade. But what most fail to realize is that the white women of those days were even more cruel than their husbands and sons. Hear the horror stories of the former slaves who escaped, the men who were dehumanized by their female slave owners, forced to live like beasts, and taken advantage of at every opportunity.
And they would use adjectives to sort of entice buyers, lusty slaves, a fresh cargo of crime.
This is the untold truth historians have been hiding from you for decades. The shocking tales of how black male slaves were abused by white women. The story of Rufus. They called him a bully, a traitor, a tool in the hands of the slave masters, but Rufus was just like every other slave trying to survive. Working under the Texas sun was tiring, but it was nothing compared to the sadness of making babies he couldn't claim, and being treated like cattle by other humans like him just because of the color of his skin. He used to be rebellious once, but after years of enduring harsh beatings, starvation, and intense punishment, his instincts told him it was better to do whatever his owners wanted, even if it meant getting other slaves pregnant so the white owner could sell their babies.
Slave status is heritable through the line of the mother. The slave societies of the Americas.
When Rose Williams met Rufus back in the early 19th century, she completely despised him. He was the resident breeder owned by the unknown Texan slave master, and his job was to provide services whether he wanted to or not. The book Rethinking Rufus tells his story and how, like many black men at the time, he was seen as an hypersexual tool and a willing participant, when he was just as much a victim as everyone else in this story. Even the wives and daughters of the slave owners weren't exempted in this scandal. We're not sure why they do it. After all, these slaves are supposed to be subhuman, so why force or coerce them into performing activities? Perhaps it was their way of exercising their power over these slaves, or they just needed more pleasure than their husbands can give. But does dissatisfaction excuse their decision to violate their slaves? Absolutely not. Contrary to the image painted by the media, white women were not mere spectators during the slave trade. From the wives of the slave owners to their daughters and siblings, every woman in every slave-owning household was taught to be cruel and inhumane to slaves, especially the men. It was a culture they were taught from their very childhood. Some fathers would even gift their daughters slaves from as young as 6 months old, so by the time she grows up, she'll understand the concept of slavery and why she's superior to the slave. As the child grew, she would also be required to perform cruel acts against the slave. She'd participate in the punishment and sometimes initiate them herself. According to stories told by former slaves, these women turned out to be more cruel than their fathers. As a matter of fact, many of the horrific experiences these slaves went through were at the hands of the slave master's daughters and wives. But it wasn't always beatings and torture. Sometimes these women would force the men into sexual relationships. Since they weren't free men, the relationship was non-consensual, whether it was done willingly or forcefully. Because of the power dynamics between the slave owners and the slaves, there was no way these black men would refuse the advances of their masters and risk getting severely punished or even killed in some cases. One such story takes us back to the year 1787 in Maryland, where a black slave was forced to have sex with a free black woman at gunpoint. Fighting back would only make the situation worse, as these men were capable of cruelty beyond your wildest imaginations. So not only were they abused by their masters, just like Rufus, many were forced to take advantage of their own people just for the white man's entertainment. Because these people were considered property, their owners exercised total control over their bodies and could legally ask them to do anything they wanted. Everything was allowed under the legal system, and the only lines that could be crossed were morals. But why would there be a discussion about morality in a society where humans were allowed to own other humans?
Were the personal, private property of their owners, and law recognized.
For many of the women who abused their male slaves, it wasn't about sexual pleasure. The idea was to exert as much control over these men to compensate for their own inadequacies. You see, slaves weren't the only ones who were marginalized by society. Women at the time were also considered property. Their men had little to no respect for them. They had very few rights, unlike today. And violence against women was allowed and even encouraged in many places. So how did they respond? By oppressing the only set of people lower to them, the slaves. After all, it wasn't a crime to beat them, sexually assault them, or force them to sexually assault other slaves. To these women, it was their way of getting their lick back by dishing out a portion of the treatment they got to the ones below them. Speaking of legality, back in 1859, the Supreme Court of Mississippi ruled that a black enslaved man could not be convicted of sexually assaulting an enslaved woman, because apparently only white women could be sexually assaulted. The same rule also applied to the men. Reverend Israel Massey was one of those who witnessed these horrific times. He was born into slavery in Emporia and recalled how enslavers would send the men to the field to farm, milk cows, and cut wood, just so he could get their wives. Some would fight to free themselves, others would simply give in to avoid harsh punishment. Elizabeth Keckley also survived this kind of ordeal. Just like Reverend Massey, she was also born into slavery in the Piedmont region of Virginia, before being sold to North Carolina. In the book Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, she recalled being repeatedly violated by the son of a wealthy plantation owner who lived nearby, getting pregnant in the process, and fathering a son for the man. It wasn't unusual, it wasn't condemned.
Her father, the man who she thought was her father, she named him George.
And it definitely wasn't illegal. Another story from 1826 talks about how 2 students at the University of Virginia forced themselves on a 16-year-old slave girl and later stripped her naked and beat her for giving them a disease. The story is well documented in Alan Taylor's book, Thomas Jefferson's Education. White Women Who Traded Slaves. Written by Stephanie Jones Roger, the book reveals how complicit these women were in the exploitation and oppression of black women. For years, white women have been presented as fragile, innocent, and naive. They're seen as mere spectators who watched their husbands, brothers, and sons maltreat the slaves. Historians would like us to believe that they didn't participate or encourage violence against slaves. The popular narrative is that they didn't even trade slaves. Instead, the fault is placed on the men in their lives, while they're exonerated from any responsibility. But were white women as innocent as historians would like us to believe? Number. Especially not in the antebellum South, where women bought and sold slaves, beat them to death, sexually abused them, and treated them even worse than the men according to documented historical record. Jones Roger explores the life of a typical Southern household, where children grew up watching their parents violate their slaves. This was the norm, and every child was encouraged to do the same. There was the story of Lizzie Anna Burwell, the 3-year-old girl who asked her father to cut off the ear of a slave named Fanny, and constantly requested new slaves for herself. According to the book, it was normal for parents to give their children slaves as gifts, and those slaves were required to address these children as masters and mistresses. Rebelling against this rule was a crime punishable by death. In the antebellum South, the only property a married woman was allowed to own were slaves, so many of the white women of those days took pride in how large their collection of slaves was. Ownership of slaves wasn't transferred to the husband, and many of these wives bought and sold slaves from their own homes. Just because they were women didn't mean they treated their slaves any better than the men. Speaking of which, ever heard of the white slave owner who became the most prolific serial killer in history? The Horrors of LaLaurie Mansion, 1140 Royal Street, New Orleans, April 10, 1834. Thick, dark smoke filled the streets as the heat of a burning building scorched everyone nearby. No one knew who started the fire, but with the level of damage already done, it was pretty obvious that the LaLaurie mansion was not going to make it. Outside the building, Delphine LaLaurie struggled to salvage what she could. Money, jewelry, clothes, anything she could move out of the house before it got totally consumed by the fire. It didn't take long for rescuers to arrive on the scene, trying to put out the fire and save whoever they could before it was too late. However, in the midst of the confusion, many of the spectators began to ask one very important question: where were the slaves? After all, LaLaurie owned a large number of African Americans, many of whom belonged to her husband, Louis LaLaurie. So why was she alone, struggling to pack her things out of the burning building? Judge Jean-François Canonge was among those who entered the house that day, and nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. Right there in the kitchen was a 70-year-old black woman bound to the building with an iron collar around her neck and a wound on her head so deep that she was too weak to walk. Without wasting time, the rescuers cut the woman loose and took her out of the house, and that was when she revealed a very disturbing secret. She started the fire. It turns out the elderly slave had been chained in that position for a very long time, and on that fateful day, she decided it was better to burn to death than to endure the harsh torture in LaLaurie's secret room of horror. At first, this was very confusing. Of course, just like every slave owner, LaLaurie wasn't a saint. She violated her slaves, subjected them to harsh punishment, and worked them till they dropped. The only time she ever went overboard was when an 8-year-old slave fell off the mansion roof and died. She tried to conceal the incident by hiding the body in a well, but some of her neighbors who saw it all play out reported her to the police, and she was forced to pay a fine and release some of her slaves. The punishment didn't work, though, because those same slaves were bought by her relatives and brought right back to her so she could continue torturing them. However, this particular incident was way more gory than the first one. To give the people a perspective of how bad it was, the 70-year-old slave took them to the attic, where they found other slaves tied down, mutilated, and so starved their skeletons were visible. Some were clamped down on the table, others were suspended by neck with their limbs stretched and torn. A few of them had their skins peeled off in several places, some were crammed into small cages with their limbs broken so they could fit. This wasn't just an attic. This was a torture chamber, and Delphine LaLaurie became known as a serial killer, because apart from these slaves found alive, many had died by her hands. She was versed in the art of torture, knew how to inflict pain on her slaves, and was so sadistic about it that she never agreed she was wrong. As a matter of fact, whenever she and her husband were questioned about how they treated their slaves, he told them to mind their business. While slavery was still a thing at this point, and many of the wealthy people in New Orleans owned slaves themselves, they still had a standard on how not to treat your slaves. As soon as news of the discovery got out, a mob of local citizens descended on the mansion with so much anger that they demolished and destroyed everything they could find. By the time the police were able to take control of the situation, the only thing left of the property was the walls. Very few stories reveal the role of white women in slavery like this one, unlike the popular narrative where they're seen as mere spectators who would watch their husbands maltreat the slaves. White women in those days were actually heavily involved in the purchase and abuse of slaves. Sure, women like LaLaurie were plain evil in their actions, but that's not the whole story, because even the men were involved in the abuse, sometimes physically and sometimes. The untold horrors of male slaves. It's a concept that has been stigmatized throughout history, which is why you don't hear many stories of white men sexually assaulting their male slaves. But does this mean it never happened? No, not really. As a matter of fact, there are many cases where white slave owners subjected their slaves to their desires forcefully.
You attacked me.
Miss Blanche, I never
Hush
done...
your mouth.
Sometimes they did it for pleasure. Other times, they did it to exert control and break the spirits of these slaves. Famous historian Thomas Foster wrote about this in his article, The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery, saying, black manhood under slavery was also violated in other ways that are less easily spoken of then and now, namely, exploitation of enslaved men. Does this mean many of the slave owners were gay? Not exactly. So why would a straight man lay with another straight man if he's not gay? Well, you see, the practice of violating male slaves in those days wasn't exactly about... It was an expression of superiority, a way to destroy the slave's psyche, make him loathe himself, and ingrain in his brain that he's nothing more than a piece of property. The truth is, many of these slaves didn't rebel against their reality because that's all they believed they were, slaves. They had been taught through violence, dehumanization, and constant oppression to see themselves as lesser than humans, equal only to the beasts on the fields. So whatever their masters did to them was accepted, because what were they going to do about it anyway? Since they weren't allowed to have an education or understand the concept of fundamental human rights, many of these men didn't know that was happening to them was a violation of their right to safety and security. But even if they did, the question still remains. What were they supposed to do about it? Charles Clifton talked about this in Rereading Voices from the Past, revealing that in many cases, many of these slaves and slave owners didn't consider themselves homosexual. It was a case of forcible sodomy that had nothing to do with and everything to do with promoting cruelty. A good example of this was a slave named Olaudah Equiano. At 22 years old, Equiano managed to buy his freedom from his master, giving him the chance to tell his story. When young Equiano and his sisters were kidnapped in Africa, he was separated from them and transported to America on a slave ship. While on his way in the winter of 1762, he met a man named Daniel Queen, who was twice his age, and during the trip, they found themselves in a relationship. Of course, Equiano spoke about Queen with so much love and admiration, but also claimed that he didn't understand the dynamics of their relationship. It wasn't based on attraction, whether mutual or one-sided, and it definitely wasn't as beneficial to him as it was to Queen. So you could call it a predatory relationship. In his words, Equiano claimed Queen messed with him, and it wasn't until much later in his life that he realized he was being preyed upon. Then there was Luke, another slave whose story is recorded in Harriet Jacobs' narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. In the book, she tells the story of the young man owned by a wealthy man. After the man tragically died, Luke was passed down to the man's son, and that was when his story took a very dark turn. From there on, Luke was chained to his master's bedside so he could be available whenever he needed to satisfy himself. He wasn't the only one, though. Unlike other slaves, Luke wasn't allowed to go outside or even wear pants. He would spend all day and night in his shirt, so he could be easily flogged, beaten, and violated. Apart from living naked from the waist down, Luke was also forced to do whatever his master wanted, whether he liked it or not. In the book, Jacobs used words like freak and filthy to describe the relations between Luke and his master, highlighting the homoerotic undertones. In 1855, Frederick Douglass published a book titled Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, telling the story of his enslavement and the horrors he endured at the hands of his master, Edward Covey. Between January of 1834 and Christmas of 1835, Douglass was locked away in the home of the slave breaker. You see, Douglass wasn't your typical subservient slave. He was rebellious, hot-headed, and defiant. His master didn't like this, and as was the practice in those days, sent him to Covey so his spirit could be broken. In his first month at Covey's house, Douglass was sent into the woods to collect 2 woods with 2 oxen. However, thanks to his lack of experience, he ended up damaging the oxen, the wagon, and a gate. As punishment, Douglass was sent into a secluded part of the woods and ordered to strip. When he refused, Covey rushed upon Douglass with something of the savage fierceness of a wolf, tore off the new and thinly worn clothes, and flogged him like a beast. Not only did Douglass get flogged, he was also sexually assaulted in the process, and soon this became a regular thing. He would be taken into a secluded part of the woods, stripped down, flogged, and sexually assaulted. Exposing his nudity, flogging him brutally, and violating his manhood was a way of breaking him, and sadly, it worked. By the time he left Covey's home to go back to his former master, he was extremely subdued, just like his master wanted. His rebellion was gone, his confidence diminished, and he was nothing but a shadow of the man he used to be. By 1847, Douglass was a free man, and with his newfound voice, he decided to put out an anti-slavery newspaper known as the North Star, where he recounted the experience of his black brothers and sisters at the hands of the slave masters. In an open letter to his former master, Thomas Auld, Douglass finally talked about his own experience at the hands of the slave breaker, how he was violated multiple times and never remained the same after the experience. Here's our subscriber's pick for today. People don't take about the shocking abuse of black male slaves by white women, and it's a part of history we can't ignore. This image, depicting a male slave bound by chains and surrounded by nude white women, is a classic example of the reality in those days. It was a time when black people were treated as property, forced into sexual intercourse with their slave masters, and sometimes even used to breed their own people. We don't talk about it, but it happened and it can't be ignored. Yes, it's been many years since slavery has been abolished, but the reality is the remnants of this era still remains in our society today. Do you believe the history of slavery should be taught in schools across America? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. You know what else is controversial? The fact that white women forced black slaves to get pregnant, took away their babies, just so they could breastfeed their own babies. The dark history of wet nurses. White women really hated breastfeeding. Believe it or not, they believed that feeding a baby made them equal to the slaves, so they made the black women do it instead. Getting someone else to breastfeed your baby is a concept not a lot of people are familiar with today. But during the days of the slave trade, it was extremely common. However, the truth is, it didn't exactly start during the slave trade. Way before the slaves came to America, rich white women paid lower-class women to nurse their children. But as the slave trade increased in the United States, many women who owned slaves found a way to get this service for free. The plan? Get these black slaves pregnant by force, take away their babies once they give birth, and force them to breastfeed the white babies. Since these black women were considered inferior, more white women began to see breastfeeding as a demeaning and uncultured act. To ensure that there were enough black women available to breastfeed, these white women ensured that their female slaves were bred by the male slaves as soon as they got pregnant, so they could both give birth at the same time. Since the black child was deprived of breast milk from their own mothers, many of them suffered from lack of proper nutrition. They had diseases that would have been avoided, were neglected by their caregivers, only to grow up and be sold into slavery themselves. Or should we talk about the emotional neglect they suffered, being separated from their own mothers at birth and placed in the hands of strangers who would not show the same level of care and love they'd get from their mothers? The saddest part, even when slavery was abolished, this practice didn't exactly stop. Sure, people were no longer allowed to own other people. But with the Jim Crow laws and intense segregation, there was no way a black person would get the same rights and treatment as a white person. Times have changed, and things have gotten better to a very large extent. But back in those days, black people had as many rights as livestock. So even though they didn't have their chains on anymore, wet nurses were still treated pretty much the same. These black women were still forced to leave their families behind and provide life to babies that weren't theirs. They had to abandon their own children, even newborns, to take care of the white babies, because their mothers believed breastfeeding was a dirty, disgusting thing. Sure, they got paid now, but the wages were so unfair that it was almost as though they didn't make anything at all. But just because they were taking care of the white children doesn't mean they didn't get beaten, starved, or mistreated. The duties changed, but the treatment remained the same. Even after slavery was abolished, black women who worked as wet nurses were maltreated by their madams. Why they continued to do this, no one really knows. But if history is anything to go by, it was probably so they could maintain that power dynamics, continuously reminding the black women they weren't equals. Martha Washington. Before President George Washington got married, he owned about 18 slaves. But after Martha Dandridge Custis moved in 1759, that number rose to over 100, thanks to the 84 dower slaves Martha brought into the marriage. That was over 260 years ago, when women didn't have a legal identity apart from their husbands. Marriage then was a bond that tied the existence of the woman to the woman.
By the authority appointed in me by the Church of Life, I now pronounce you spouses for life, and you may kiss the bride.
So whatever she owned before marriage now belonged to the man. Women couldn't vote, couldn't own land, couldn't go to the university, couldn't enter many professions, and practically belonged to their husbands. However, the only exception to that rule was their right to own slaves. It's quite strange, but even though a woman was supposed to lose everything as soon as she tied the knot with a man, one thing the law didn't take away from them was the right to own humans as property. Thanks to the inheritance she got from her father and first husband, Martha owned 5 plantations, sitting on around 17,500 acres of land, where over 300 black slaves worked. It was out of these 300 that she separated 84 when she became the wife of the future president.